All right. So I'll just start with a quick introduction and then we'll move on to the session. The idea is that we'll have maybe about 30 to 40 minutes for a discussion or maybe sharing from the grasshoppers into what they're up to. And then we'll move on to an open discussion where we invite all of you to share, ask questions, or really try and figure out how we can take things forward. Um, but to get started, I think I wanted to first thank you all for joining us this evening. It was really like just before the call, I was going through, who all are coming for this discussion, and it was really nice to see such a wide variety of, people from very different professions coming in. We had people who were doing permaculture. We had landscape designers. We had, we had a lot of people who are working with institutions which are focused on the environment that are also here. We also had a lot of people who signed off as concerned citizens, and I think that was also really nice to see in the registration as well. And I think that just goes to show the kind of effort that needs to be done at this point of time. And it was really nice to see the idea that there are people who are showing up as just concerned citizens towards this topic that we are about to discuss today. And which is what it also means, no? So it's not just about, while this is one of the things that we are discussing in terms of restoration for what does restoration mean for the Delhi Ridge, it also means that it's not just an isolated case. There are a lot of places where restoration might be being taken up as an activity by different kinds of institutions or government bodies. And how do citizens come together and help out in this? Right. So I think that's what this kind of discussion felt for me. And apart from that, I want to start by saying usually we used to have these kind of forums every month. We used to have something called community meetings at ERA, and the idea was to give space to members of the community to step in and share about things that matter to them. Um, so as we do that, um, we it can the form of that really kind of changed over a period of time, and then we decided it might be better when there is something, because when you're trying to meet online and have discussions, it doesn't give that same feeling as it might be when you meet in person. So we thought when people need that space, then ERA can provide that space to community members or to the member group and see how they'd like to take things forward. Given that, I'd like to introduce the Grasshoppers. And the Grasshoppers, as you may have read, even on the post, is just a group of people who are, looking at public spaces more carefully. And in that, in the hope of then we might find better ways of doing these things, right? And the Grasshoppers also, and how they tie into ERA, also comes from this idea that um, I don't know which conference it was, but in one of the Panchgani conferences, I remember a sudden flurry of movement between and reorganizing towards the outside of the auditorium. And suddenly, a lot of people from who were from Delhi got together and just stood there to take that one group picture of themselves, right? Just to kind of document that we are all here together. And that spirit also continued afterwards, no? Because it continued in the form of these meetings that happened informally in Delhi. And that is where the Grasshoppers also formed as this group, and including people way beyond just the membership of ERA, right? So with that, I think I'm really keen to hear more about the Delhi Ridge, what the Grasshoppers are up to, what is the citizen report that they've been talking about is shaping towards. And I'd like to kind of hand it over to Pradip at this point to take it forward.
Um, Hi, everyone. I'll just say a word or two about the Grasshoppers because we first came together, I think something like 7 or 8 months ago, where we just said that, look, all the people who are part of ERA in Delhi should really get together and see what we're all up to and whether there is something that interests all of us and what's going on. And we thought that maybe we should start by looking at public municipal parks, and eventually perhaps even create something that we will publish either periodically or together, that talks about the things that we think are, not very clever things in terms of how parks are planted up, but also about things that they might be doing right, or about an old tree that happens to be a lovely old relic of some earlier time. But really just to spark conversations about municipal agencies and what they do in their parks. And then, of course, the ridge thing hit us. So starting about 2 months ago, we suddenly got very concerned about what was happening on Delhi's central ridge. And these are not problems that are confined to the central ridge. They're actually confined, it's all across the ridge. But we thought that it might be better to be very pointed and choose just one portion of the ridge that we know really well and begin to talk about the ridge in terms of what's happening. So I'm going to just present a few slides that talks about, gives you a brief history of what's happened on the. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, Pradip, it's
Yeah.
visible.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Delhi's central ridge, just to give you a sense of where it lies on the map. The picture at the bottom left shows you, the high ground marked in shades of pink and red. And can you see my pointer at all? Is my pointer visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, so where I'm pointing now is basically the Rajpath, so very much the power center of Delhi, the central vista. So the central vista is this. Sorry, the central ridge is this little portion here, which is then amplified in green on the top right. So it's roughly 8 square kilometers in size, and when you think about it, it's actually quite amazing that even today, with all the pressures that Delhi's had, you have 8 square kilometers of semi-wild rocky forest in the heart of a metropolitan city. Now, just to cycle back a little bit, this is a map from 1850 that shows you a time when the ridge was intact. So the northern ridge and the central ridge were all part of the same landform. It's now, subsequently, because of Paharganj and Paharipur and other areas, the area that's just northeast of this yellow ellipse has all got sort of lowered. And what you're seeing in pink is the old city of Shahjahanabad. So New Delhi is actually built south of Shahjahanabad, immediately to the right of where this yellow ellipse is. Now, the first time that the ridge springs into prominence is when Lord Harding, who was the viceroy when the new capital was decided to move the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. They're arguing about where to situate Government House, the viceroy's residence, and they have talked about Raisina Hill, but without cutting the top off. And they think that this big avenue, which is what they call the Kingsway, what we now call Rajpath, was actually going to be starting at Raisina Hill and then going in a northeasterly direction towards one side gate of the Jama Masjid. And this would have involved actually buying up Paharganj and displacing people. And they didn't have the money to do this. The war was imminent. And somebody takes Lord Harding riding on the central ridge in August of 1912. And you can imagine that at that time of the year, the ridge is looking particularly wonderful. The rains have happened, all the ground flora is up, all the lionas and creepers are up. And Harding is charmed, and Harding says, can you imagine what it would look like? He says, just to read what's on the screen, it's perfectly obvious to me, he says, that the only site for Government House is on the ridge above Talkatora, commanding the most lovely views over the city of Delhi. Now, this never actually happens, but this is the one moment when the ridge swims into focus. And what Harding actually says is that, look, this will work provided we can plant up the ridge with interesting flora and make it look a little bit like Versailles. And he calls in his favorite forester, a man called Peter Clutterbuck, who is conservator of forests in the United Provinces. And Clutterbuck comes to the ridge and is asked to see whether whether it's possible to recommend species to plant on the ridge that would make the ridge look really nice. And Clutterbuck's list, which we've looked at in great detail, is actually quite a wonky list because he actually is proposing trees and shrubs that would not, in fact, do very well on the ridge. And this has been the perennial problem with the ridge. Now, I just want to remind you that, when people think of Delhi, it's very easy to think of Delhi as being one kind of landscape, one habitat. But ever since the Sultanate, ever since the 14th, the 15th century, when the state has levied revenue on people who are growing crops, it's important for the state to assess the productivity of the land. And when they do that, they're actually dividing up a space into different ecologies. So, for example, the floodplain of the Yamuna, which is really where most of Lutyens' Delhi is today, is the most productive part of Delhi, and that would have attracted the highest revenue. The ridge attracted no revenue because they thought that who can possibly grow crops on a thin-soiled, rocky hillside? So right from then, people have known that the ridge is not a good place to plant things in because it has shallow soils, thin soils, it's extremely rocky. So all the evidence that we have, and there's not a lot of evidence, but just judging from maps and a few travelers' accounts, the central ridge was in very poor shape in 1911 when the capital shifts to Delhi. But they start to, even though the Harding's idea about situating Government House on the ridge gets Rad Karod, and it doesn't happen, they start to plant up an experimental area of something like 200 acres on the ridge. And once again, if you look at the species they're trying things like shisham and other, 8 different species. None of them actually belong to rocky, dry parts of, to a rocky, dry ecology. So the minute they withdraw irrigation, all the trees die. And they're struggling with this. And then this man called William Musto, who is served in the Punjab for the previous 20 years, knows the Punjab really well. And Delhi, you must remember, is one of the southern districts of the Punjab until 1911 when it's hived off. So he's very familiar with the Punjab. And he says, look, I'm going to plant this Mexican and South American tree called Prosopis juliflora, which is now called Neltuma juliflora. And there's a lovely account by a young architect who later becomes very famous, who at this stage in 1920 is serving as Musto's assistant. And he describes Musto going out in a little car on Sunday mornings with 2 coolies and little saplings of Prosopis juliflora and finding little pockets of deep soil. And then he gets his coolies to dig with their crowbars. And he says, one day, this is going to become a thriving forest of Prosopis. And of course, he's right. Because what happens in effect is that Prosopis is so aggressive, is so successful, that it outcompetes everything else. So the ridge becomes completely a forest dominated by Prosopis juliflora. And that is pretty much the state that it remains in. It gets worse and worse over time. We followed what happens in colonial times right up to 1947. And essentially, they're trying to plant it up without any success at all. And Prosopis gets more and more successful. And it's only around 2021 that you start seeing the government and the forest department beginning to make a difference on the ridge. What arouses that interest is not clear, but this picture that you have in front of you is what is called a CA, a compensatory afforestation program, where one of the judges in the High Court says, look, if you have to compensate for some trees being cut down for development, then choose one of these degraded places on the ridge and do your compensatory afforestation there. And that's really when I first came to see what they were doing on the ridge, which was clearing out everything, ironically, except for the precipice trees, which are still standing in this picture, and then going and using the JCBs and digging these holes in straight lines. Now, you're probably curious to know why the precipice trees are not being cut down in this picture. And the answer is that in 2021, the government made a mistake of appointing me to an advisory committee for a new ecological restoration of the Central Ridge. And a gentleman called Dr. Babu, who has done a lot of projects with government in Delhi, he's a retired botanist. He says, I have been appointed to restore the ridge and make the plan and make all the proposals. And I intend to restore the ridge to its pristine purity. And these two words, pristine purity, occur again and again in all government documents. And I'm going to make it like New York Central Park. And a lot of us who were listening to this online, because this was COVID time, so we weren't meeting in person, we said, are you serious? Do you really mean like New York Central Park? What is it about New York Central Park that is a restored natural area? It's a beautiful park, but it's not a restored natural forest, and it's got acres and acres of lawns, and it's got tennis courts. And he said, yeah, we also intend to have tennis courts. And he said handball courts, and that took us. Again, we took a step back and say, do you really mean? Who has handball courts in Delhi? But what are you trying to do to the ridge? And as his plan unfolded, one of the things that he said, because we asked him, we said, how do you intend to get rid of precipice? Because it's everywhere. It's such a dominant presence on the ridge. And he said, we will get rid of precipice by lopping its major branches, and we will let light down into the forest floor. And there we will plant climbers that will climb up the precipice trees and strangle them. And it was an effort for us to conceal our laughter, because we said, look, this is a completely cockeyed idea. Have you done this anywhere? Is this something that you could? But he was on the back foot. And then for the next 3 months, we actually had this back and forth all on email, where we were saying, look, Dr. Babu, we don't think your ideas are particularly sound. And eventually he gets very angry with us and he resigns from the project. But the entire plan and the entire tactic is taken over by the forest department. And this very plan about growing climbers to climb up the precipice trees and strangle them becomes part of the dogma that the forest department spreads in all its documents. So this is some of the clearance that has happened during this time on the Central Ridge when they're cutting the major branches. You can see that that's happened in the picture on the bottom right. And then they talk about the species that they're planting. But the first thing they do is that they completely clear the ground of everything, including all the woody stuff, a lot of it native stuff that is actually growing on the ridge. Now, I'm going to be a little brief because I don't think we have a lot of time. I just want to say that when we have started to speak to the forest department and tell them, why are you doing this? There are better ways of doing this. And why have you not identified what we call a reference site? A site in the same kind of soil, the same kind of minerals, same climate. And we have this amazing place called Mangar Bani close by. Mangar Bani is slightly different because it's got more slopy hills. And as a result, it tends to be more dominated by a particular tree called Terminalia pendula. But it's interesting that not a single stick of Terminalia pendula has been planted by the forest department. Instead, every single list that we have seen, and Vikram is x-raying all these lists in one of the chapters that we're writing for the citizens report, every single list is filled with trees that don't belong to this particular ecology. And the result is inevitably going to be that they're going to have huge amounts of watering and irrigation that they're going to have to do. In their tenders, they talk about irrigation regimes that go on for 7 years. And apart from that, the kind of transpiration that's going to happen from trees that don't belong here and that, that have bigger leaves is also something that's very frightening. We've also had some extremely frightening thoughts based on tenders that the Forest Department has issued. One of them, for example, was a tender to destroy termites whenever they're planting. So they recommend that the contractors, when they're doing the planting, that they use two chemicals, two termiticides, one of which is a banned chemical in India, which would actually destroy everything in the soil. And we've been saying for a while that, while the ridge is a degraded forest on top, above ground, it's got, it's really precipice and very little else. In the soil, the microorganisms in the soil, the fungi, the termites, the biocrust is where the real wealth of the ridge lies. And as long as that is intact, there is hope for the ridge to become again a wonderful natural forest. So in this particular case, we wrote to the Forest Department, sent them bell book and chapter about how, first of all, termites ought not to be targeted as enemies because they are actually ecosystem engineers. They're no longer to be regarded as foresters used to as enemies. But we wrote to them again with all kinds of references to say that don't poison the soil. This is what you're doing. Just a few more pictures of stuff that's happened in the last week where they're literally, JCBs are going through clearing woody vegetations, smashing termite mounds, as you can see in the bottom, and making, so there are now proposals that we're beginning to hear of making special Vanas on the ridge. We don't understand where this is coming from because this is not part of the working plan that the FRI has made for the ridge. But there is a suspicion that this is coming from somewhere else. So you get these Rishi Vanas and Panchavati Vanas and Ritu Vanas that are now being constructed. So this little hut presumably will house a Rishi who will live with a moat around him and plants that you can see at the bottom, which are all entirely ornamental plants from parks. And the picture on the top left is how they intend to plant up the ridge. So the FRI's document, which is the management plan for the ridge, actually recommends 2,500 trees per hectare, which translates into 1,000 trees per acre. So in their vision, this is a dense woodland where canopies are meeting and there's absolutely no sunlight reaching the ground. Of species that are of dubious nativeness, right? So this is just to give you a little background of. Sorry, how do I get back to stop sharing? Yeah, this is just a little background of what's happening on the ridge today. I don't want to consume too much time, but we'll talk more about this in the questions. Can I hand this back to somebody who wants to say something more from our group?
Yeah, I think maybe just to continue this forward, I think Divya also was going to had some pictures and things to show from the ridge. So maybe we'll hand it over to Divya.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just going to kind of quickly move through the things that I wanted to show. Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
All right. Okay. So I just want to begin with, of course, we've seen some pictures that Pradeep has already shown, but this is just to give you a sense of what an undisturbed part of the ridge would actually look like. And what you see here is that it's not very tidy. It's like a mosaic of shrubs, grasses, climbers, and every layer has a function. And it is the combination of all of these things coming together that keep the landscape intact and also helps it regenerate itself. But if we compare it to what the forest department has in mind in terms of how they are planning the eco restoration, as we see here, one of the things that I wanted to touch upon, which I think really stood out to me, was that as one of the key features of the eco restoration method, one of the things they have mentioned is weeding. And the idea of weeding actually belongs to agriculture or conventional plantations. And it comes from wanting one plant to succeed over all others. And that's generally when you want to improve the yield of a crop. But a forest isn't a crop. And in a natural ecosystem, there are no weeds. They are only species occupying different ecological niches. So restoration should work with that complexity and not erase it. And in fact, even in agriculture today, this myth that weeding is necessary is being busted. And we can't have stable ecosystems in spaces that are biologically sterile. So if when we see this, I mean, the obvious next step I would imagine for the forest department would be to, as Pradeep mentioned, clear everything. So the first thing that happens is that the forest floor is cleared of shrubs, grasses, young plants, etc. And this perhaps they do to make their plantation work easier, and also it furthers their understanding that anything that they don't want to grow needs to be weeded away. This all of this vegetation is seen as obstacles and not and their actual purpose in the ecosystem is forgotten, which is multifold, and it protects the soil, it shelters wildlife, it retains moisture, and allows for natural regeneration. So once they've basically gotten all of your understory out of the way, the next step is for them to bring in the JCBs, whether it is to knock down the larger trees or to move soil around for whatever hardscapes and landscaping that they want to do. But this also makes us understand that they see soil as dirt, and in an intact ecosystem, the soil is a living ecosystem of roots, of fungal networks, of microbes, insects, and tiny air spaces. And all of this heavy machinery, as it moves along the soil, it compacts it. And you can very clearly see in these images the impact that this such heavy machinery has had on the soil. It completely disrupts soil life and reduces the soil's ability to absorb water, and in turn damages also the regenerative capacity of an ecosystem like that. And once they've basically brought in the JCBs, there is a lot of indiscriminate sort of cutting and deforestation that we've seen. There are these large piles of, cut shrubs and trees. And the assumption is that they're only removing invasive plants, but which we have seen firsthand is not the case. They are in practice, they are removing entire patches of vegetation, shrubs are cut, native trees are felled. And we see here, for example, on the screen right now, this is a ronge tree. This one is a dhak, and then a barna. All of these really iconic trees of this ecology and of this landscape, all of being knocked down in the name of ecological restoration. And as Pradeep showed us, they clearly have a very different idea of how they want the forest to look or how they want the central ridge to look. We've got these cottages for the Rishi Munis. And once they've done all of that, you've got these neat, straight lines of planting pits. And nature doesn't plant in straight lines. Forests regenerate according to rock, shade, moisture, seed dispersal, and microhabitats. Straight rows like this completely ignore the niches that already exist in this landscape and replace them with a plantation template, where everything is very, very linear. So this is essentially to give you a sense of what is happening currently in the Central Ridge, what is it looking like, what are some of the principles that the Forest Department has in its mind, basis which they are working. And by this, the fundamental question I think these images would raise is that why are we trying to dismantle a functioning native ecosystem in order to create a plantation? Because the Central Ridge is clearly not an empty site that needs to be transformed into a garden. It is already an existing forest. So yeah, this is what it could look like versus this is what their vision for it is. Yeah, that brings me to the end of the
Yeah.
slides for now.
Thanks, Divya. And next, I think, Vallari, if you would like to also share from your side what you've been observing around the Central Ridge, even the history, to a certain extent. And yeah, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Arjun. So I'm just going to reiterate, I think, a couple of points that Pradip has already made. And what you see on the screen right now is a photograph of Mangar Bani. And the point is that there are all these amazing reference sites quite close to us. I mean, Mangar is one of them, but there are other sites in the Haryana Ravlis, north of Jaipur, around Alwar area, where, as foresters or restoration practitioners, if they really understand restoration, they would go and have a look, understand the vegetation, and understand what to do at the ridge. Because as has been pointed out both by Pradip and Divya, what is the vision of the ridge right now, with whom, with the forest department, with the FRI, who should be the experts in this. Their vision of the ridge is very, very different. And the vision of the ridge that we have or that nature has is very different. So I'm just going to show you some photos of Mangar, and these are all taken by Pradeep. You can see the beautiful dhok forest in it. And when we were recently visiting the ridge, we did see some patches of dhok over there. So wouldn't it make sense to have some dhok in whatever plantation plans or restoration plans the forest department has? And okay. This is how it looks. I mean, this is a beautiful image. I think this is from the monsoons. I'm not absolutely sure. This is what the understory looks like in a dhok forest. So this is almost purely dhok. And you can see it is not very dense. It does allow sunlight to come in, which takes me back to the point that Pradeep mentioned, that FRI's working plan has this idea of planting up to 1,000 plants per acre, and creating these dense woodlands which don't naturally exist in this area and which won't survive either. And this is the mistake that has been done for over the past century. The British did make the same mistake. They tried to convert the ridge into a broad-leaved forest with species that wouldn't survive there. And we really have to learn from that and do what is the right thing. This is what dhok looks like when it's grazed. It responds spectacularly to grazing in some ways. It focuses, it doesn't die. It spreads into this, it forms this mat-like network all over the ground. This is dhok again in the dry season, which has its own beauty. And these are some images from forests of central India, and you can see like these, it's a mosaic of forests and savanna lands. And this is presumably what, the central ridge would look like or should look like. Some images here as well. And in fact, even in Mangar, if you go down in the valley, so the slope is obviously dhok, but in the valley, you do have different species. You have Palash, Bargaz, Kem, Holoptilia, and these are all species suited for that area. So we do have a whole bunch of species to work with: trees, shrubs, lianas, grasses. And it's really shocking that the forest department and the FRI have not taken this into account. In fact, even back in the 1920s, there was this forester called Aaron Parker who documented all the species in the Central Ridge. And if you look at his list, it's very interesting because about 80% species are the species that are native to that area. And even then, my understanding is the other foresters or people who were planting up the ridge didn't really look at his list. And so they ended up planting species that are not suitable instead of the ones that were known to be from over there. And then Musto ended up spreading Prosopis, Flora all over, which did spectacularly well and took over this entire patch. So one of the things that we've been doing apart from like this webinar is, trying to bring this into the public domain. So there are a bunch of articles that different people from the group have written. on, what is happening on the Central Ridge and why we think it is so problematic. And, I think it needs to be stopped or paused immediately till we understand better how to do this. Uh, yeah, that's all I have. And I can leave you with this picture of the Hope Forest.
Thanks, Vallari, for those pictures. And I think because you touched upon native flora of the ridge and what that could look like, you gave a few examples. But maybe I'll invite Vikram here to share more about the native flora of the ridge and share with us some of the pictures that he also has and his ideas about the species that are found there. Yeah,
Uh,
over to you, Vikram.
yeah, thank you, Arjun. Um, so I'll just share my screen over here. So I'm assuming my screen is visible.
Yeah, it's visible. And
Okay. So yes, I just thought I'd take you all through some of the spectacularly beautiful native flora of the ridge, which, as the others have mentioned, that the above ground, the woody flora of the ridge, uh, the tree flora specifically, has been largely overtaken by prosopis, as Pradip has mentioned, as Vallari has mentioned. But what remains or what is retained in the understory is a spectacular panoply of native flora ranging from shrubs to herbs to lianas to climbers and uh, a large diversity of grasses. So I thought I'd just take you all through some of these species that are ironically being bulldozed and cleared as we speak right now, in the name of ecological restoration. So the first one we have here is Rus mysorensis. Um, as you can see, it is a deciduous plant. It goes barren for some part of the year, but come the monsoons, it has these really pretty trifoliate, meaning three leaves with three leaflets and these wonderful berries that are actually edible. Another extremely dominant, meaning that you find it in large amounts on the ridge, is Caparis stipiaria, or Hees as it's called in Hindi. Hees is actually one of the few ridge shrubs that is evergreen, and come early monsoon, it gets covered with these spectacular white flowers, and it is one of the few species that actually, because it's evergreen, provides some sort of how should I say this? It provides some sort of uh, closure in the canopy, in the understory, when the rest of the plants are usually barren or when the rest of the plants are leafless. So it's important for ecosystem function in that sense, that it allows predators and prey to hide from each other, for example. It's also famously the larval host plant of pioneer butterflies. And if you go to the ridge in the summer, you'll find dozens of pioneer butterflies laying their eggs on the heaths. Then, of course, we have the care, that is Caparis decidua. Caparis, or the care, is another iconic tree, primarily of the western Rajasthan desert flora, of the Thar, but it's also found in smaller amounts on the ridge. Again, extremely pretty looking plant with edible fruits, as many of you might have heard of Care Sangrika Achar. And as Pradip has shown and as Divya has shown, decades old or maybe even century old trees of uh, and shrubs of heath and care are being bulldozed as we speak right now. Coming to the herbaceous plants, that is plants that are annuals, we are don't have woody parts as such. One particularly interesting example is Abutilon ramosum, which is a species of mallow that is uh, extremely common in the central ridge, but is not as common in the other fragments of the ridge, like Sanjayvan or Jahanpana City Forest or Kamla Nehru Ridge in the north. So it's really quite unfortunate that a species that is relatively rare, and because most of these species are extremely poorly documented, as in we don't know where populations of these species exist elsewhere in the Aravallis and to what extent, it's really unfortunate that one of the last known stands of Abutilon ramosum is being cleared as we speak. Then, of course, the northern Aravallis and specifically the ridge, if I remember correctly, have 8 to 10 species of Saidas. This is one such example of a Saida species. This is a monsoon annual, so it will come up in the monsoons, and by October or November it dries up. And something that can't be missed are the various species of lianas and climbers on the ridge. So this is again an extremely pretty species of climber that grows in the monsoon. What's notable about many of these species, especially the climber species, is that while the coming up in the monsoon and drying up in the post-monsoon winter season, the rootstocks are perennial and woody. So the plant germinates from the rootstock every year. And if you bulldoze the habitat, if you move the soil with JCBs, you're really killing these rootstocks. And that causes people briefly in one of the articles that was put up on the screen. So along with biocrusts, these perennial woody rootstocks are permanently and irreparably damaged once you bulldoze the soil the way it's been done in the central ridge. Here's another pretty looking perennial vine. As I said, it comes up in the monsoons and persists as a rootstock in the rest of the dry season. And here are, this is another monsoon annual. This is a herbaceous plant. And what's interesting is that the Delhi Ridge has close to 2 to 300 such native herbaceous plant species. And many of these have become severely restricted in their ranges in the Delhi region and more broadly in the NCR region as well. This is primarily because of land conversion from open natural ecosystems which used to be found in the northern Aravallis and the Delhi landscape into agricultural land. So the ridge fragments, including Mangar, including the northern ridge, and including the central ridge, are some of the last refugia for much of this native biodiversity. This is another native perennial herbaceous plant. The scientific name is Pupalia lapacea. It has these tiny birds that stick to clothing. So if you ever take a walk in the ridge and you come up with you emerge with birds stuck all over your body, this is the plant that does that. And no conversation about the ridge or about the northern Aravallis is complete without mentioning the grasses. So Delhi records actually over 90 species of grasses in the region, and approximately 30 to 40 of those species are found on the ridge and nowhere else. This is one such example of a native monsoon annual grass that comes up densely in the understory and all the ridge fragments, including the central ridge. And what's interesting in this photo is that unlike some of our ornamental grasses, this actually plays host to some species of lepidopterans. You can see a caterpillar over here. Here's another grass that's usually found in plainer open natural ecosystem areas, but can be found on the ridge as well. This is Chloris flagellifera. Again, a grass that you're unlikely to find anywhere else in, say, a 50-kilometer radius of Delhi other than the fragments of the ridge. So I hope I did some justice in highlighting the beauty and uh, just the rich biodiversity that the ridge has, which is being lost currently as we speak because of earth movers and JCBs trundling over and moving the soil. Um, as Divya and Vallari and Pradip have mentioned, what we actually need is well thought out ecological restoration that without disturbing the soil, um, slowly and gradually removes the invasive species and supplants them or replaces them with native species. But as I hope I've convinced you, this doesn't need too much doing in terms of the herbaceous flora, because much of the herbaceous flora of the ridge is already there. It just needs to be protected. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikram, for that. And of course, we've now seen a lot of the native flora that you might have at the ridge, and I'd invite Malvika to share with us what they have seen as the fungi that also is found on the ridge. So maybe Vikram, if you could also stop sharing your screen, that will be great. Yeah. So now I'll invite Malvika to go forward and talk about what they have seen as fungi in that landscape and share from that perspective as well. Also, please note you might have seen the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, please drop your questions in the Q&A. I know we've received 3 of them already, but as we go on, we can carry on populating that. Over to you, Malvika. Thank you.
Thanks, Arjun. Am I audible?
You're audible, yes.
Yeah, hi. So I don't have any photos to show you all today, and that's because what I want to communicate today is that we need to learn how to care about what we can't see in any forest. And in most forests, a large amount of the total species, the living creatures of that forest, exist underground. Some of you may have heard, some of you may not be familiar with fungi. So fungi, just really quick, are neither plants nor animals. They are a third kingdom of life altogether. And their primary role in any ecosystem is that of decomposers. Decomposers, as in those who break down organic matter that has died, that has lost its vitality, and breaking them down into the constituent nutrients and returning that into the soil so that new plants can grow. So fungi are absolutely essential to the ongoing sustained life of a forest. And what we're losing in a restoration plan like this is the ability for a forest to continue to sustain itself, to stay alive despite or without all external actions. All the earth movers that we see, JCBs, all of this action on the ground, what it does is it disrupts the underground fungal networks, which exist in the form of these thin mycelial strands, they are called. The mycelium, these thin strands that exist in the soil all year round. Now, in the monsoon, sometimes, we might see mushrooms popping up, we see brackets on trees, we see all sorts of molds on the ground, but the fungal organisms themselves exist year-round within the soil, and they are essential to that year-long cycle of the forest. And a forest, like everybody else mentioned, is not a garden. A garden needs tending, a garden needs planting, it needs watering, it needs the addition of nutrients. That's what fungi do in a forest. They are already the caretakers of a forest, of an ecosystem like the ridge, where they are providing nutrients. They have the ability to hold soil together. So especially in an ecosystem like the ridge, where it is sandy, it is rocky, it is a savanna kind of ecosystem rather than, the dense, lush rainforest that we think of when we think of fungi. That kind of soil is held together by those mycelial strands underground. Those same mycelial strands also allow trees to access water from far deeper into the soil, reducing the need for constant, repeated irrigation, as one would do in a garden, in a plantation, in an agricultural context, like Divya had mentioned. So what happens when we churn all this soil up is we disrupt all of the connections that mycelium provides between other forms of life in the forest, whether those are trees, shrubs, all the native flora, and other plants as well, even those which are non-native. Mycelium is what holds everything together. As it stands at the moment, there is no record, there's been no survey of fungal life in the ridge. Of course, informal surveys have been done. We have all been seeing the fungal life of the ridge over these years. But as far as the plan for the restoration of the ridge goes, not only does it not have any plan for the fungi or for protecting the fungi or for allowing fungi to do their work, it doesn't mention fungi at all. In fact, it does mention fungi briefly 3 times only as disease, as causes of rot, as harm to nursery plants, to plantations, to young saplings. And that is a view of restoration, which again looks at a landscape not as a forest, but as a garden, as a place where we must protect things against the natural forces of life. So yeah, I think at this point, the most urgent thing is to stop the churning up of the soil of the ridge, to protect the system that allows the ridge to persist, that allows the ridge to continue living as an ecosystem and not as a sterile plantation, as Divya had put it.
Thanks, Malvika. And a lot of what you've all heard today is also being put together in a citizen report. And I'll also invite Pradip at this point to come back to share about that as a citizen report and any closing remarks, and then we can open the floor for a discussion.
Yes, so we when we first got together to talk about what we thought could happen, we thought that maybe it's really important to write a report in, we thought initially 10 or 12 chapters, it's now becoming something like 15 or 16 chapters, where we put together information, scientifically sort of reliable information, that addresses all of the issues you've heard about and some more. Things like, is planting trees the answer? And what is the value of what lies underground? Things like that. So that's what we are engaged in now. We think that in another month or so we should have a citizen's report ready. Do we imagine that the forest department is going to read the report and suddenly say, oh my God, we didn't know any of this, we're going to now suddenly change our way of working? No, I don't think that's likely to happen. I think what is likely to happen is that the forest department will continue to ignore us, but we think that civil society perhaps will be very interested in what's going on. But we also think that perhaps the most effective way of making a difference is by rattling the doors of the courts. And when you rattle the doors of a court, it's really important that you have information that is impeccably that information that is actually going to work in a court. So that's, with one eye on the courts, is actually what we're writing all of this for. We're also in the meantime basically trying to create a substratum of interest in civil society by making posts about some of the issues that Vallari showed you, for example, about biocrust. Whenever we've talked to the forest department about any of these issues, there was this one occasion when we wrote to them about the insecticides that they were using to get rid of termites, when they actually cancelled their tender and issued a corrigendum. And we congratulated them on that. And we said, look, just in the same way that you've done that, can you understand the importance of fungi and biological soil crusts and call off your JCBs? And they haven't done that. So they tend to be, of the opinion that, look, we are trained foresters, we know what we're doing. And we're saying, look, none of you have learned anything about restoration. Restoration is not something that is taught to foresters. It's not part of their curriculum. It's not something they learn. And Delhi's foresters in particular belong to a cadre that is posted between the Andamans and Arunachal Pradesh and Goa and Delhi. So they're really not used to dry ecologies at all. What is going to happen once we get the report out is anybody's guess. We think definitely the courts are part of the answer. We think that we want people to understand what's going on and join us and be part of the, hopefully a surge of opinion that comes up against what the Forest Department is doing. What is the ideal scenario? I don't know. I mean, one of the big issues is, what do we hope the ridge to become like if everything was to go perfectly well? And I don't think that's something that we can arrogate to ourselves to decide. It's something that has to be a big conversation with civil society, with people who are going to use it. It definitely needs to be a human landscape, not just a wild landscape that lies protected, locked away somewhere, like a protected area is. And this is something that I think needs wide discussion and wide participation. The trouble is that that's not how the Forest Department works or thinks, or it's not how the government thinks either. So we're going to need some way of overturning the reflex ways in which government works with a habitat like this. So all we can do really is test the water, see what we can do, rattle enough doors, and then hope for the best. I think we should take questions, Arjun, if there's anything that anybody...
Thanks, Pradip, for that. And firstly, thank you to everyone who's come forward for this discussion and shared their points of view as panelists. I mean, the idea was not for it to become just a webinar-like thing, but also to have a more open discussion. So I think with that, I would start with some of the questions that have already come on the Q&A. So one is, so the first one is by Charlotte Adelina. He says, okay, fascinating. So they say it's a fascinating talk. That doctoral research was on the creation and maintenance of Miyawaki forests in Coimbatore, and there are so many parallels. For example, they've also noted the arboreal bias in afforestation practices and the configuration of PNV and native species. They're curious to hear what is the basis of species selection by the Forest Department, and what is the role of Grasshoppers in your vision of the space?
Does anybody else want to answer that, or do you want me to go? Divya, do you want to take that?
Go ahead, Pradip.
Okay, so the basis of the Forest Department's lists is just nonsense. I mean, they've been making lists at least since the 1980s. There's a series of government books and documents and reports where they talk about the indigenous flora of the ridge. It's actually quite laughable to see those lists. They're based on a lot of ignorance. And the Chief Minister of Delhi recently made an announcement and said that the ridge, when she was announcing the second notification to make the central ridge into a reserved forest, she said we must plant indigenous trees like mango and imli and peepal. So this is it's a common problem, but it surely is not a problem that should affect the Forest Department. To think that because a tree is Indian, because it grows somewhere in India, it's appropriate to grow on the ridge. Vikram is doing an entire chapter in the report where he actually looks at, I think, 5 or 6 lists, Vikram, am I right? Where he's pointing out, all the mistakes in the lists. And there are numerous. I mean, in a list of something like 40 trees, you might get 13, 14, 15 trees that are completely inappropriate to this ecology. The other interesting thing about these lists is that I'll go to the precipice question first. I don't see precipice as having a role here anymore, quite frankly. I think precipice needs to be removed. The valid issue is, if precipice gets cleared out entirely, quickly, then what happens to a ridge that is stripped of its vegetation? And the answer to that is, I should preface my remarks by saying that I worked in Jodhpur for 16 years,
handling precisely this issue of a landscape that was covered with Prosopis juliflora. And what you do is first of all, you remove it by hand. You don't use JCBs, because what we discovered was that Prosopis has a budding zone that goes down 2 feet below the ground. So you don't need to reach down to it, to the base of its roots. You just need to dig down a little more than 2 feet to stop Prosopis from coppicing. And that's perfectly possible to do by hand. Will it be slower than using JCBs? Yes, of course. But maybe slowness is what you need, because ideally what you would need to do is that if you have, the forest department controls something like 6.5 square kilometers of the ridge. Not all of it, but 6.5, that's a huge swathe of land. But I would think of a phased program that lasts maybe 20 years or more, where you take out little bits at a time and you go on planting wherever you're removing Prosopis. So that by the time you've reached year 4 or 5 or 6, you've already got plants growing up behind it in years 1 and 2. So I think Prosopis has to go. Prosopis has a competitor, which is the Subabul or Lucina leucocephala, which is even more aggressive than Prosopis. That needs to go as well. It has terrific germination success. I was very amused to see that in the FRI's working plan, they've done some sample plots and they said that there's no regeneration of Lucina, which is just one of the funniest things I've heard in a long time. So yeah, we need to get rid of Lantana and Subabul and Vilaiti Kikar for sure, because they inhibit other things from growing on the ridge. And we need to bring in the right kind of plants onto the ridge.
Just on that note, Pradip, there's another question around this is, do you feel the narrative around Vallati Kikar and Subabul being invasives have been weaponized by the state departments to clear forests? And do we as ecologists or ecologically minded people need to be more mindful and careful around how we talk about plant species as well?
Well, it's interesting that it's really only in the last year that the forest department has started removing Prosopis. Before that, they were just lopping the large branches and leaving the trunks. So it's only now that, in fact, they've decided that yes, these species have to go, and they've done that on the basis of the working plan. But yeah, it's a delicate conversation, Arjun, in a larger sense and also in a philosophical sense. But in my experience, Prosopis does so much damage, so much inhibition of flora that grows around it. There are plants that are not affected by it, a few, but most plants are very affected by the allelopathic, the chemicals that it sends into the soil, the alkaloids, in its root zone, in its leaves. So Prosopis really does have to go, but you have to do it in the right way, and you have to do it with being very, very careful not to churn up the soil.
Arjun, I just want to add to that, because I've been hearing this from 2 or 3 different people. And, as far as I know, as ecologists, we've always said, yes, Prosopis needs to be removed or Subabul needs to be removed and replaced by the right species. So the argument has always been removal and replacement, and it's never been just removal. And there's been a lot of discussion and debate as to what is the right way of removal, what is the right speed of removal. And there are ecologists across the country, who are not just talking about it, but experimenting with different ways, and not just on the ridge, but in forests across the country. And I also, I believe that it is being weaponized by the governments and authorities to clear lands of forests, and maybe by, other groups, to land grab or to something else. And maybe, maybe as ecologists, we can have a conversation on how do we talk about this going forward. But at the same time, I want to say that the conversation has always been, removal and replacement in the right way. And it's unfortunate that it has been weaponized in this manner.
Thanks, Vallari. Yes, this is definitely one of those conversations that we've always had at the ERA community as well, is how do we really talk about invasives? Are they really invasives or are they first responders? What is the way to kind of look at removal and how do you look at replacing eventually? Because even as what Pradeep pointed out earlier, uh, you know, if you suddenly go for a quick removal, you will have more chances of doing more damage to the entire landscape, and also you will end up kind of disturbing the biodiversity that has already made its home in that landscape, right? So this phased wise approach or a very careful removal and replacement, like what you suggested, Valerie, of course, are the ways to go forward. And yes, as we said that we should have to think about how do we look at discussing this and making sure that it does not become as a major tool for people to do land grab or weaponize this because of this term itself, be able to do a lot more damage uh, in the landscape. I'll move on to the next question. And again, I think since we are still talking about invasives, I'm going to move to a different kind of a question right now, and then we can come back to this again. So there's a question by Pranav Kapila, and he asked, what's the next step? What citizen-led mechanisms can we use to exert pressures on the authorities to, one, halt the uninformed destruction that's currently taking place, and two, to pivot to sound restoration practices on ground, pivot to sound restoration practices. On-ground mobilization can help, as it has done with the Aravali's issue recently. So, opening the floor for one of you to answer this.
Look, the basic issue is that you've got an agency of government that keeps everybody out, does not consult anyone, and says we know what we're doing, and then does everything that we consider is actually very harmful for this landscape. Ideally, what needs to happen is, a big collaboration between the forest department and people who know what restoration is all about, where they invite people in to sort of help them to understand what they ought to be doing. That we're very, very far from that situation, right? That is some, that's an idealized situation that I don't think is likely to happen. And that's why it's becoming more of a confrontational issue than an issue where you're trying to reach out and say, look, why don't you understand, these issues because they're important. That doesn't seem to be happening. But how it's going to play out, frankly, I don't know. I think it's going to play out, it's going to continue to be in this confrontational idiom where we actually have to reach out to the courts and say, look, this is what they're doing that is very harmful, and please stop them using JCBs, for example, and stop them using species that are not part of the natural flora of the Aravallis, and so on. There are dangers in that because, in the past we've seen that the courts themselves, we had a judge in the High Court in Delhi who said, no, just plant fruit trees on the ridge, just grow peaches, grow papaya, grow mango, and he had a list of his favorite fruits. And he actually dictated to the forest department a list of 7 or 8 species that he wanted them to grow. And he says, pani ki koi kami nahi, there's no shortage of STP water, so just water these plants and keep them alive on the ridge. So, we're dealing with a situation where several things conspire against good things happening. One is that there is a general lack of understanding of what ought to be done. We're talking about an imagination of what ought to be done. The reason why New York Central Park was talked about by Professor Babu, I realized is deeply ingrained into the minds of these foresters. I had a meeting 10 days ago with the forest department, and they asked me point blank, they said, have you been to New York, sir? And I said, yes. Why are you asking? He said, have you seen New York Central Park? I said, yes. So what is wrong with our making New York Central Park on the ridge? And you realize that while they talk the language, they use the words ecological restoration again and again, repeatedly. So does the FRI's working plan. But the imagination has nothing to do with an ecologically restored landscape. So that's, it's a very, very big gap. It's a huge gap. And that's why our only hope really lies in making the public much more aware of what can be, what could be, what should be, right? And in rattling the doors of the courts. But I can't think of what else to do. But I'd be very happy to hear of any ideas or suggestions that people who are part of this webinar would like to offer.
In case you have anything that you'd also like to share back, then if you can raise your hand, I'll also unmute you so you can also share if there are any ideas of what can be done to take it forward. Meanwhile, I'll move on to another question, which is again building up on these lines. So one is, in fact, there are about two questions that seem similar, and I'll take those one after the other. So there's Gopesh Singh, and he says, "Hi, we live in a part of Vasant Kunj, which is called the Morphological Ridge, and have a few parks bordering the JNU wilds. My suspicion is the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, at the advice of the Forest Department, has started to chop the Vilayati kikas that we have and are also digging up pits to maybe plant trees that have currently caught their fancy. We need to stop this madness before it becomes rampant. How do we try ensure that it is stemmed ASAP?" Right? And I think this is something else another person has asked is what can we do as citizens if we want to protect these kind of forests? Right? So just opening this floor again for all of you, if somebody has an answer or a suggestion to Gopesh and citizens to generally take up things in restoration or to help out. Sorry. Yeah. Got Parul.
I have to admit that I don't have an answer. The thing is that you have a Delhi Tree Protection Act that allows you to register a complaint if a tree is being cut without permission. But if the forest department or a municipal agency with the permission of the forest department is removing Prosopis juliflora and replacing it with a plant that they consider to be appropriate, that's the problem. That's exactly why we're here and what we're debating and what we're talking about. So until we bring about a change of mindset, much more awareness, where we can actually shame the municipal agency for doing the wrong thing, nothing is going to change. We're powerless to affect the change, is what I'm saying.
I think to that, Charlotte has also responded on the chat that, sorry, Vallari,
Arjun,
did you have something to share?
yeah.
Yes, please feel free to unmute and come in. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, we also don't want to be so hopeless. And I know that because of all the posts that we've shared on social media and articles we've written, that's why so many people are here on this webinar. And a lot of people have been asking, okay, what can we do? And the thing is, we've also been talking about it. Definitely, as Pradip has said, we will be knocking on the court's door. But, one thing I feel that can be done is just writing to the authorities with the concerns we have. And hopefully we can share like some email addresses or, of people that you can write to. I am not sure if some people have talked about doing a public protest or a dharna. I am personally not very sure about that, how that would be organized. But if groups want to do that, if citizens want to come forward to do that, sure, that can be something that can be done. But like Pradip has said, it's really it's about the basic understanding of what is ecological restoration that is at stake here. So we are trying to get down to that aspect. And can we stop this process meanwhile? I don't know, actually. We don't have the answers, but we can try in these various ways. So I don't want people to feel like they can't do anything. Maybe even if it's writing a letter, that can be impactful.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, I think that, yeah, and the whole idea, like what you pointed out, a lot of it is, of course, because of these posts, this awareness has come in. It was mentioned in the starting that because there was pressure made about not using a certain chemical to kill the termites, that actually happened. It's not that it was not taken into account. So, of course, if we all write and if we all kind of share it across, there is change that can happen, but we can't promise what that change will be and how it will come through.
I
But
think
if
if
you have
if
anything more to
the
share.
government and the authorities know that citizens value these forests, I think that can also go a long way in, halting some of these things.
I should share one other little positive piece of news that the DCF West, who's in charge of the Ridge in the Forest Department, called me to say that, the plants that you've been seeing, the ornamental plants you've been seeing, it's just the contractor who is storing his plants there. He's taking them away. So then I pointed out to him that, but he's already planted some of them there. When we went there yesterday, they were already planted. He said, we've told him to take them all out. So something is moved, something has changed, right?
Yeah, that's yeah. I think P. Narayan also says to everyone that's great, and yeah, I think that's what I mean. As long as we are vocal about it and we continue sharing, and you guys continue sharing, and others also join in, there will of course be there will of course the authorities will also hear and try and figure out what is best, what else can be done for the village. Just a few more questions on the chat. I know we're also close to time, so I think. There are two questions here, maybe about three or four questions actually that are there. But one of them is from an anonymous attendee, but they say it's very interesting to learn about the biodiversity and ecological history of the ridge forest. How can we learn about these things for a space on our own? And what would be some reliable sources of information and some good practices? And I think it'll be really nice for all of you to kind of share how did you go about discovering all these different whether it is the history about the ridge or really engaging with the ridge and understanding the flora. What were your methods of kind of trying to understand that and how they can also apply for other spaces when it comes up?
All right, so just to talk about, when I was writing my book on the trees of Delhi, I spent some weeks both in the National Archives as well as the Delhi State Archives. So, for example, for the colonial period, there are something called arboriculture returns that are written for every year by the government. And it actually details exactly what is planted, what's happened that year, whether there's been a drought or whether there's been excess rainfall, whether there's been frost. They talk about how much money is actually spent in a particular part of the ridge. So we actually have fairly rich information about the period leading up to 1947. Interestingly, the information actually dries up after that, partly because I think I haven't actually pursued what's available in the archives in terms of Indian government records after that, but I don't know to what extent records were kept in the same kind of detail, right? But what you start to get after independence is the beginnings of the sort of encroachment happening on the ridge. The ridge is, as you can imagine, great real estate for New Delhi. It starts off as being the western edge of the city, a kind of semi-wild area where Bada Sahibs go riding their horses. But as the city expands westwards and you start getting Karol Bagh and all the western extension areas and all of that, it engulfs the ridge, and ridge becomes part of New Delhi, right? This almost the heart of the city. So you start getting things like the Rabinder Rangshala, and you get the Army Public School, and you get a CRPF place. So a lot of this gets publicity because there are NGOs like Kalpavrikshan, like Ravi Agarwal's Toxic Link, that take up ridge issues with the government in the 1980s. So a lot of this is documented. So I think just by searching, just by digging, you actually can get a lot of information about your places that you're interested in. The archives helped for ancient, for a long time ago. But when you want more recent stuff, you really, I mean, now with the, with the net being the way it is, if I had been researching my Delhi book now, it would have been a different book, I think, perhaps, because it's so rich in terms of what you can actually dig up. And there's so much archival information that's available online.
Thanks. Yeah, Vallari, would you also like to come in here?
And you can learn from all the other people. Like I learned a lot from a lot of people who are here on the webinar. So that's been a rich source of information for me. So you can learn from books and other people's talks, and a lot of people are doing nature walks in which they talk about these things, and that's a really great way to learn and share knowledge.
And hopefully the citizens' report we write is also going to be a rich source of information about the Central Ridge in particular, in terms, not just in terms of its history, which is not the focus of what we're writing, but in terms of what is the way to do things in the right way. What is important in terms of the way in which you irrigate plants and give it too much water? What is wrong with using STP water that is anaerobically treated? And what are the effects of using that water on ridge soil, and things like that, which are terribly relevant to any kind of restoration work that's going on in the ridge. So hopefully it will be a very rich source of information for restoration in general, not just for the Central Ridge.
Thanks, Pradip. I think there's also a comment and a question really also. It is by Avinav Gupta, and just kind of building up on this point. It says, but this is a long-term problem that spans across geographies, individual officers, etc. I feel we need to ramp up groundwork for a larger framework of how to do restoration and good practices. Something like the work done to bring systemic change, say the fight for RTI or Manrega, for example. I know this is easy to say, but so hard to do anything about, and it needs a lot of political mobilization too. So the question really is, how does one seek to bring some changes into the IFS from within, for instance?
I just want to share that we've been talking about this in ERA for a while now. Arjun knows that. One of the ways in which we have hoped to try and make a difference is to actually conduct ecological restoration workshops with forest departments. We actually did a very nice one with the Forest Department of Madhya Pradesh about 3 months ago. At the same time, we did a terrible one with probationers at the FRI. The thought was, let's grab them young, let's talk to them, let's imbue them with ecological restoration ideas when they're joining the service. And they were so supremely disinterested in the subject that we left so absolutely deflated and dispirited, because they really weren't paying attention at all. And I don't know, I had very uncharitable thoughts about why this might be so. I questioned the motives of the people who are joining the forest department. Why are they there? What are they there for? They really didn't seem in the least interested. So there are lots of things we need to get right. But it's really a matter of building up a momentum, I think, in civil society, helping people to understand the issues more clearly. Right from what is a native tree? Your chief minister is saying something so nonsensical that it's gobsmacking, So just spreading the idea through civil society that you need to actually plant the right thing in the right place, and it's not a matter of just planting an Indian tree like an alm or or an imli on the ridge. So you start there, and then you slowly build up, and there are so many other issues. Look at trees themselves. Look, quite honestly, around the year 2000, how many tree guides or plant guides did you have in this country? I can think of one, which was a Bombay Natural History Society, tree guide that was actually pretty useless. And look at it today. Today you get, you've got plant guides, tree guides, and field guides to to termites, to ants, to insects, to reptiles, to butterflies, to dragonflies. I mean, there's been an explosion of interest. So this is the kind of momentum that we hope will happen, that to diffuse ideas that are solid ideas and scientifically sort of proven ideas about how to go around ecological restoration properly. But maybe Parul has something to offer us about networking and just holding hands and taking this forward.
Yeah, thanks, Pradip. Actually, I was just thinking about, because you invited me to, talk about as a network viewer, or what it means, what we can do, and there have been few questions around it as well as citizens, what we can do. And I was just thinking about it, and I think that it's very true that this is happening in the Central Ridge right now, but it could happen anywhere. So, now, what if this is what happening in our own backyard? So, one way to respond is through the local governance and legal systems that are meant to safeguard our ecosystems. And we do need to exercise those rights. So, by writing and signing petitions, meeting the concerned authorities, and sharing our feedback and concerns as active citizens. But I also believe, and I strongly believe, because we are looking at now. At a pan India and across the geographies and across the ecosystems, this kind of an attitude and like a behavior and a predisposition towards our ecosystems, that we need to be more proactive and examine whether our own relationship to the place, to the people and the community needs rebuilding. So we should really ask whether spaces like Central Delhi Ridge are part of our everyday imagination, and whether we have any relationship with them that allows us to gradually build a more nuanced understanding of the ecosystem beyond, instrumentality. So what it might look like, though not necessarily, is that local people become more aware of the bird, trees, and grasses and develop an interest in the seasonality of forest, grasslands, and wetlands and similar ecosystem. And it's so crucial that this happens, that it becomes part of our everyday lives and our imagination. So some, like, if my response would be that, after this meeting, some of us may end up helping the Grasshopper team put together a very strong petition. And some of us could choose to get to know 10 plants in our neighborhood. And one thing that I would say is that I think that one thing the Grasshoppers have in common is the relationship of curiosity with the rich. They have taken several walks to the ridge, both individually and as collective. And I think, I may be wrong, but I strongly believe that this years of this long-standing relationship with ridge, along with a mutual learning circle, that has played a huge role in their advocacy for it. Having said that, we are also receiving several messages on social media posts asking what all of us can do as citizens. And honestly, we would take this opportunity to invite all of you and would love to hear from you. So if you have suggestions, ideas, or recommendations for ways forward, especially for the Delhi Central Ridge, please feel free to reach out to the Grasshoppers at delhigrasshoppers@gmail.com. We can share the link, share the address in the chat box. And if you want to reach out to ERA and write to us, then of course at hello@era-india.org. So this is something that I wanted to say, and maybe I will end up by saying that there is something very important. I think the Grasshoppers have, through their presentation, through their work, are bringing a notice. And it's that it's not just a right methodology, ecological restoration methodology, but the imagination itself, which is guiding forest department. And it's not Delhi Forest Department only. Now, if you look at it, what is happening at Nicobar Islands and, being compensated, the forests are being destroyed there and the compensation is happening in Aravali's, and what is happening in Arunachal Pradesh. So what Pradip and Vallari and Vikram all through their presentations have been trying to say, that there is a imagination, a kind of imagination that thinks that ecosystems, trees, everything are replaceable. That if something can be, replaced, which is actually, it's not the case how the life works. So I think we are open to suggestions. We invite everyone and looking forward to your suggestions and connecting after this meet as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for staying on this call. I know there are a couple of unanswered questions, but maybe we'll try and take that up via email and get back to you. So thank you so much for this. And yeah, uh, thank you to all of you who kind of spoke. Pradip, Vallari, Divya, Vikram, Malvika. Um, thank you all for kind of stepping up. And I know there are also a lot of people who are part of the Grasshoppers who've been doing a lot of this work, which are not really out here right now speaking, but there are a lot of people who are also contributing in the background. So it was so nice to have all of you here for this discussion, and thank you once again. Any last words from anyone else at this point? So we've dropped the email addresses on the chat. Feel free to write to share your suggestions to us out there. And Valerie had also kind of her camera became. I mean, she switched on her camera, but the cat decided to say something. But over to you, Valerie, if you have anything to add.
My cat is saying time to end the meeting. But I just wanted to say, please write to us with your questions and suggestions. I know we weren't able to answer everything, and we'll also think a little bit more about what collective actions can be taken, and we will get back to you. So please do stay in touch with us.
Thank you.